The Me Too movement continues to be in the news. Just today comes news that a prominent Southern Baptist church leader has been fired from the presidency of a seminary because of demeaning comments to women. Even the Nobel Prize is being compromised by a sexual abuse scandal. Last month, we had a panel of women who gave us an overview of their opinions on what the movement is, where it's going. Today, we're hosting a panel of men to add their perspectives on this timely issue. And I'd like to introduce our panel. Starting from the end, Rajeev D. Majumdar is an attorney, and we have some breaking news. Rajeev was just elected president-elect of the Washington State Bar Association. This is the first time since 1965 that a person from Whatcom County has been elected to that post. So history has been made. Rajeev's practice is focused on serving as general counsel to business entities and their litigation needs in Whatcom County. He also serves as prosecutor for the City of Blaine and as the special prosecutor of Bellingham's Mental Health Diversion Court. As an adjunct professor at Western Washington University, he teaches rights, liberties, and justice in America. He previously worked for the National Security Administration in Washington, helping to establish protocols of cooperation between the U.S. and other nations to ensure the containment of weapons of mass destruction technology. In 2015, he received the Washington State Bar Association Local Hero Award for his work in improving public access to civil legal aid and advocating for the indigent. And he also serves on the boards of Law Advocates, Northwest Youth Services, and Sun Community Services. Ryan Roberts is a sustainability professional at Kulshan Services LLC in Bellingham. He received a bachelor's in business and sustainability and a minor in entrepreneurship and innovation from Western. Ryan works with people to visualize and manifest a more sustainable future for their organizations, their communities, and the planet. Before he worked with Kulshan Services, he worked at Western as the Associated Students Club business director. At the university, he was influenced by the diversity and inclusion training he received on campus, and he actively engages in conversations with friends and family about privilege, race, and gender equity. He's an active member of Conscious Crew, which is a harm reduction nonprofit which creates safe places for people at festivals. Ryan believes businesses have an opportunity to lean into leadership by building more just and sustainable workplaces. And Toby Ten Eyck is an instructor in the sociology department at Western. He received a PhD from LSU, Louisiana State University, in 1998, and was a faculty member at Michigan State University from 1999 to 2015. Michigan State, of course, has been in the news with some recent sexual abuse issues. His research and training has covered topics as diverse as food safety, risk, and how we talk about art. And speaking of art, he and his wife currently own the art gallery Wandering Oaks in downtown Bellingham. So please welcome our panelists. So let's begin. It seems like it's taken a long time, but now the Me Too movement is here. And I'm wondering what our panelists think. What took us so long?
We have to hold the speaking stone while we talk. That's to prevent us from aggravating each other and fighting. Actually, I don't know if it's a question of what took us so long, but now the opportunity is here. Society is changing so fast with the internet media diversifying in an extreme amount because of the internet, information is what's available to everyone. And it's that communication of information that allows different groups of people to band together and call attention to issues. Now, this has positive and negative consequences. White supremacy has seen a beautiful surge in popularity since the internet was invented as well. But if we look at how the Me Too movement started, it was a Twitter post. Now, that's just something that was inconceivable 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, or 20 years ago, that someone sitting on their phone could launch a whole movement and discussion that would result in us volunteering to sit up here. I think that's what's really happening is people can share their experiences. And when you can share your experiences, you can find what you have in common. And when you find what you have in common, you find out what the problems and the solutions are, I think.
Okay, just ask if you hold this up closer to you.
I think I agree with everything Rajeev said. I also, as someone who's not only a professor, but for a number of years I was in radio broadcasting during the Anita Hill situation, Monica Lewinsky. So this topic has been around for a long time. We all know that. But if we think about how those women were treated, how many more would want to step forward in that arena that is controlled by men, right? And now you have the social media where, there are opportunities to have a circle of very supportive friends. You see things like the Arab Spring come about, and it's like, wow, that made change. Black Lives Matter, that made, people are paying attention to it. Sure, there's backlash to all of these, but all of a sudden there's also a lot of support as well. So I agree, the social media is huge, but also the way we have treated this situation before it, date rape, marital rape, all these things have only recently been talked about, yet they've been around for a long, long time.
I think what we're seeing is a combination of changing social mores that is facilitated in large part by the disruptive technology of the internet. And just to mirror, I think, what you two have said about social media and the internet, and enabled people to elevate their voices in their own communities where they receive support for that. In instances prior to that, I think we had, it was more difficult to actually be judged fairly by your peers when they were mostly men in those cases. And so if you are now in an arena where people who've had similar experiences to you can mirror those and support you in your efforts to gain visibility and to elevate your experience, that's changed the dynamic dramatically. And I think without that technology, we may not have seen such a rise in that. But I think also, too, we have an incredible uprising of incredibly brave women who have stepped up to the table to really bring light to something that's incredibly painful to them. So we wouldn't want to shadow their courage with the fact that with the technology that's contributed to it. But it's really a confluence of those factors.
Let me ask you to take it a bit more personally and ask, what's been your experience of the Me Too movement yourself, professionally and personally? And as you're thinking about this, do you sense that this wave of sexual misconduct allegations against powerful men, has this led us to what is truly a historic moment, or is this just a blip that will go away?
I think that I'm hopeful that this is a lasting change, and I think that like I said before, with the changes in disruptive technology that we have with the internet, have unlocked that as an opportunity to continue with some momentum forward. I think for many people still living with the experiences that brought them to initially, announce that they had some sort of experience, that for those people it's super real every day of their lives still. And I know a lot of people who've had those experiences and who shared that with me, and the Me Too has given them a platform to elevate that conversation, but it hasn't really changed necessarily for them on a day-to-day basis dealing with their trauma.
not surprised, shocked with how many women that I know have posted on Me Too. Women who are amazingly strong, which doesn't surprise me at all, but just how many of these are just amazing people who have been put in situations by doctors, by friends, by bosses. And then when I ask students, I given that I teach at Western, just had a class yesterday, and the class is Sociology of Risk. I asked them, I said, here's some questions that might be asked tomorrow. What do you think? And one of them was this whole notion, is this change, or is this just a lot of noise and things aren't really changing? And a lot of them said it's good that it's out there. It's amazing that it's out there, but I don't see a lot of difference. And these are mainly female students, and some of the males said that as well.
I guess I've seen change on two different ends. One, with the students at Western, I teach at Fairhaven College, which is, maybe you know the reputation, is always already considered a fairly radically progressive place. The students have definitely become charged up and energized by this debate, but such to the point that it can sometimes be difficult to bridge the generational gaps between us. Because they're very excited about this, and they're very excited about being empowered, but there's something inherent to universities and a lot of society that is hierarchical and top-down in nature. And part of this whole movement is there's a challenge to the rigidity of that hierarchy and to how strong the control and power is someone above has over someone below them, making society more transparent. But the most surprising thing to me has been the number of women I've met who are not, I'm picking my words very carefully here, not extremely positive about the movement. I haven't seen as much backlash from men as I have from women. And again, picking my words very carefully, a lot of that has been generational in nature that I've noticed, and that has surprised me, and it's something that frustrates me, much like the Equal Rights Amendment, something my mother educated and campaigned about in my youth. And you ask young people today, what is the ERA, and is it important? And they don't know what it is. For those of you too young to remember, the Equal Rights Amendment is a proposed constitutional amendment to declare that men and women are equal under the law, which is not currently the law of the land. And they don't know what that is. And that's kind of a basic foundational keystone. There are some basics, but again, I'm talking about legal issues, and some of these are social issues. An analogy, and lawyers like to make analogies, is that marriage equality. And in marriage equality, this is something I was very passionate about in law school. I'm not sure why. Maybe it was because when my parents got married, it was illegal for them to be married in several states because they were of different races. So maybe I feel some affinity to the fight there. But once the court ruled, and the Supreme Court ruled on marriage equality, and Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, and many celebrities in the mainstream came out, I thought, well, maybe the issue is over. But my mind is changing on that. Because even though the laws have changed, and thank you, many lawyers and good citizens, for making those laws change and make our society more equal, did you know that though 10% of the youth population identifies as LGBTQ, 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ? So it's not just laws that have to change. We do have to change the society. And this conversation, at least, it may not mean change, but it definitely is raising the question in everyone's head, even if we don't agree as to the solution or the mechanism by which we need to continue this discussion.
And just a follow-up thought on that too. I think I've seen similar things among my cohort of friends. People who are they're happy, I think, that it's occurring. They're happy that we're seeing more transparency with this, that we're seeing accountability brought to people in power and to people in their communities, and also a lot of caution that it may just be another blip, I think. And so many people, many men I know, I'm actually I think I was really interested in participating in the discussion in part because many of my male friends are very confused and challenged and afraid of this, I think. And that's been the most fascinating part of what's occurring here to me, is the tendency for men, even in my generation, which is a bit shocking to me, to victimize themselves in the face of this. So I noticed
To
that
see themselves as victims.
yeah. So when these things occur, the immediate thought is of kind of the trope of a vengeful woman making a false accusation. And I'm really interested in that right now. I'm gonna be honest, I don't have the answer to a lot of these things, but so I'm gonna share with you observations about that. But this idea that they are victims of this. I know a lot of people who believe that there are things occurring that would seem rather nefarious. And so that part of it is really concerning to me, because you would think that, I think, as members of this generation that have access to more information, more progressive thinking and all this, that we would have, that we would be moving more rapidly there, but I'm not necessarily confident that's the case. I think it is moving and it's changing. There's a lot of progressive language, like from the universities and in businesses moving there, but it may not be the sea change that we hope it is. So.
I'd just like to add just one other point to, the sea change and the media, the social media and its role in all this. I was just checking this the other day, working on some lectures on STIs and human trafficking, and just looking at flows of people and so on. And in doing that, I came across a list of the top 10 websites that people use. And number one is Google, number two is Facebook, but 3 of the top 10 most visited websites are adult content websites. Right? So a lot of people are going on and saying, oh, this is what sex is. Right? This is what sex is. So that, again, it gives you the mixed message. Sure, there's Me Too on Facebook, where all these individuals are talking about how they have been victims. And right next to that is these adult websites that are giving a completely different message.
Let's follow up on that just a bit. That's interesting. And when we're talking about how we got to this point, could it be that there is this, for want of a better term, a rape culture that is deeply embedded somehow in the American male psyche?
I guess I might challenge the question with the adjective American. There may be, and let me broadly cast my words as broadly as possible. If there is a rape culture, it may exist, emphasis on may exist in the male psyche, depending on how we're defining this. I honestly, before I came here, I started looking. I watched the last debate, and there were some interesting questions about whether capitalism was at fault or America was at fault. And then so I started looking at the rest of the world. All things relative. America is a fantastic place to be in regards to this discussion. That we are having this discussion speaks a lot about our country and our culture, and it's all commendable. I'm not saying our country and our culture is refined and perfect, and it will always be an evolution, but the state of Russia recently decriminalized domestic violence against spouses. Just think about that. They criminalized domestic violence, and then they decriminalized domestic violence, which is pretty bizarre from an American point of view, at least in this point in our century, if you think about it. Is there biology at play? Yes. Are we creatures of biology and evolution in part? Yes. But the amazing thing about humankind is we have these overly developed brains. And the question is civilization. Civilization is the collective exercise of all of us coming up with rules to prevent us from acting on our basest animal instincts. And it's a constant evolution. What is acceptable today was not acceptable, or what was acceptable 200 years ago was not acceptable today on all kinds of fronts. In fact, 20 years ago, not having smoking in bars was an unthinkable disaster of epic magnitudes, and now it's so normative and pleasant we can't think of going back the other direction, or at least most of us can't. I think we're evolving. I don't know if it's necessarily, I would label it rape culture, and I definitely wouldn't label it as American. There may be aspects to our subsets of male culture and subsets of American culture that do lend itself to rape, but I think having this conversation is one way of trying to move our human society past that.
Wow, I don't know how to follow with that. I think we have, I feel that I experience a bit of a tainted interpretation of what maleness is, of what masculinity is. And in a lot of my conversations with my friends and with my cohort and my peers, masculinity, the traits that they see as masculine are control, aggression, authority, power, right? And then for women, they're seeing those as compromise, agreeableness, compassion, caretaking. And there's a lot of people right now who are kind of part of that backlash, I think, to the Me Too movement and to a more equitable society that are advocating pretty fiercely and loudly for that worldview. People like Jordan Peterson, if you're familiar with him, are really pushing for a more traditional view of things in that way. And he, in many ways, is sort of a mentor to many young people young men who are very confused about what's going on and fearful of being accused or of saying the wrong thing and being outed publicly. And so I think that we needed a bit of a revamp, a bit of an update on what masculinity is and whether traits are actually inherently masculine or not. Is compassion a masculine or a feminine trait? I remember reading a study that showed that women who were police officers had far higher testosterone levels than men in white-collar jobs, right? And testosterone and the chemicals that kind of might lead us to be more aggressive or authoritative are not unique to men and women. And so I think that that's an interesting kind of bent to the discussion is like, can you be a compassionate, empathetic, caring caretaker of a family? Can you be a man in that role? And what is our role model for men when it comes to that? And we see a lot of role models for men that are aggressive, they take what they want, they're sexually empowered in that way, and then we see the opposite of that for women too. And I think that is kind of getting to the root of toxic masculinity, and I'm not certain that I would say it's a rape culture, but I think that a lot of those traits about what men are supposed to be and what we're supposed to do, especially with the influence of pornography and adult content, that those things are leading to a certain interpretation of what maleness means. And it's not accurate to what it could be, right? It could be that men would be heralded as, a mixture of those two, that we could be heralded as human beings that share in a whole host of different characteristics, as opposed to a narrow, defined role of what it means.
How many of you watch football on Sundays? All right, a few of you. Coming out of high school, I went to Portland State University and played baseball. There was a rape culture among the athletes. Absolutely, right? It was sexual conquest was appreciated, was celebrated, was expected, right? So I don't think there's a rape culture. I think there are rape cultures. I think there's male cultures, female cultures, mixed cultures, all sorts of things. The idea of culture is having a shared set of values. And, I grew up in a household where mom, dad, sister, brother, we were all equal. And Portland State football or baseball. My roommate was a football player. It was there too. Made no sense to me because half of the population, for many of those athletes, not all of them, many of those athletes had one role, right? And that was to gratify them off the field. So it was absolutely there. Now, I have not played sports at that level, obviously, for a long time. But in Michigan, I used to play old guy baseball. There were a number of leagues. This was not softball, it was hardball. The whole point was to play 7 innings and then go drink beer in the parking lot, right? Because we knew we were all going to be sore and hot and tired and so on. 95% of the content of what was going on in the parking lot, the discussions, was about females. And these are old guys.
Ryan, you're a bit younger than some of us here.
Most
Most of us. I'd like to get to this point of, are there generational differences in the way men look at the Me Too movement and in the way men treat women? What do you see?
It's evolving, I think. But I think that we look to you, right? We look to our examples and to our sort of the people that raised us, and whether or not we are looking directly to you, we are paying attention through our childhood, right? And those things become ingrained as normative behaviors that we see, and then we repeat. And I think many people in my generation are at least, I have to be careful because I think that I live in a bit of a bubble in a sense, right? University, Bellingham, okay? You all know that this is a bit of a bubble here, but still subject to many of the problems that we see. So I think that what I experience is that many men are becoming aware of some of the things that they think that we would, put in front of ourselves and say, wow, that's rather strange that that's a thought that comes to my mind, or that's a thing that we're talking about. And it still happens, and you're not necessarily, right, like the discussion about a woman walking down the street, right, like you were commenting on, and a couple of you might feel kind of like gross about that, right, at that moment, feel like, wow, why is it that we're doing this? And so there is an awareness, a growing awareness that's coming from that, that I think is a step forward, and yet I'm not certain that it's that full system-wide change, and it's hard to know too. I grew up here. I grew up mostly here, so I haven't seen large parts of the country, and I feel that what I saw at the university was really heartening. I see a lot of people having those conversations in educated environments where there's men elevating the voice of women, men taking and stepping back and leaning out in the presence of women who are sharing their stories or taking opportunities to elevate themselves. So that's been my experience.
Of course, interesting side note to that. Men are going to university in fewer numbers, and women are going to university in greater numbers these days. In fact, the proportion of women in university is not only increasing, but in medical schools and law schools, they're becoming super dominant. So we have to worry about this dialogue we're discussing, because which parts of our society are actively engaged in the dialogue? I was just looking around this room. We are not a representative group of the population, though maybe me sitting here helps the statistics a little bit. It's good that we're having this conversation, because we are also not, we collectively in this room are not respective of that young university population either. So it is good that we're engaged in this and they're engaged in this, but are all sections of our population having the same conversation? No, and that's one problem we're having these days, is we are building walls. Our president likes building walls, and many of us criticize him for building walls, but we are all also building socioeconomic and social walls that are walling ourselves up from the other tribes that exist in our land. And one thing I really try to bring to everything I'm involved in is, let's get to the other side. What are their fears and needs, and what are ours, and can we communicate and understand that? Because unless we are, I would even posit that the attempt to override the other side without their input is what causes most movements to fail. And that's one thing that is scary about the Me Too movement for many people, is that some of its proponents are very thoughtful. Some of its people involved in it are very thoughtful. Some people are very angry and very thoughtful. Some people are very angry and not necessarily as thoughtful, and that can cause backlash to the way they approach the problem from some people. And as a collective, we have to be cognizant of people's frustrations and forgive them for not agreeing with the way we would approach things, and forgive them for being ignorant sometimes. There's some people we're not going to get through to, but that doesn't mean we should stop trying, because the world does constantly evolve, as do people.
I just agree with so much of that. As someone who's lived in Louisiana and in Michigan and in the panhandle of Florida, and, grew up on the Oregon coast and in Wyoming and here and so on, is, even a group that looks like this in the middle of Wyoming, we would probably be having a very different conversation, right?
Yeah.
So it is really important. I tell my students all the time who engage in a lot of the protests and marches here in town, that they're doing amazing work, but why don't they go 10 miles north and have the same march and see how it goes, right? Yeah. So again, it is really important. I absolutely agree that I hear so many people in Bellingham, a lot of my students, I'm very progressive. I want to include everybody until someone comes along who doesn't think like they do. Mm-hmm. Right? I have so many students coming to me and say, I can't talk about Christianity in the classroom because I'll be attacked. Mm-hmm. Whether that's true or not, that's just the way they feel, and that's not appropriate on a college campus. So it's really frustrating to hear that and so on. And again, kind of this whole notion that, me too, everyone needs to think like me. Mm-hmm. Well, okay, well, and how would you feel if someone came along and said that to you who thinks differently than you do? Would you, oh yeah, okay, yeah, sure, I'll do it your way because, it's different. We don't do that very much. And just by the way, there are many athletes that I played with who were really good guys.
And I think a cornerstone, too, of this all is empathy with a lot of this. There are a lot of men who are just really trying to understand what it is that they can do to be a part of this in a productive and meaningful way, too. So I think that it's not the responsibility of women to educate men on this topic. I think that's a really key thing that we may be missing at times, but there are many women out there who are happy to educate you on that too. So I think that so taking those opportunities and leaning out a little bit. I think the initial reaction, like stories I've heard of somebody getting called out publicly, is to react in the kind of like this, wait, why am I getting called out right now? As opposed to looking at what was my behavior that led to this thing. Right, that led to this reaction. How was I behaving, and was this kind of an automatic thing that I'm doing a lot that might be making other people uncomfortable? And so that, I think, emphasizing that empathy not only with our communication with men to men in particular, I want to focus on that part of it here, is in having those conversations with people about what is and isn't okay, and being empathetic in those discussions when people don't immediately click and get what that means.
Following up on this idea of whether the movement is representative of a number of groups, much of the news over the past couple of years has been about sexual abuse by powerful men in Hollywood, in the corporate C-suites, in politics. But what about the abuse that takes place against women who don't have the megaphones that Hollywood stars do? Women who work at McDonald's, women who work in factories. Is the Me Too movement Is the Me Too movement representing them as well?
It represents their purposes. The fact of the matter is that all of the big Me Too excitement has been about celebrities or quasi-celebrities, major public figures who would be in the newspaper anyways, if not for bad things, then for whatever they were doing in industry or Hollywood or watching them on TV. It serves their purposes to the extent that there's a conversation happening in the rest of society. Being a prosecutor who prosecutes domestic violence cases, I can tell you that these intellectual debates don't seem to play a lot into the scenarios that are occurring on the ground, or at least to the best that I can discern. There doesn't seem to be a lot of intellectual conversation going on when these scenarios arise. In fact, the biggest problem in domestic violence on the ground is probably alcohol, not necessarily cultural determinations. That plays a role in almost 90% of all the domestic violence cases that I prosecute. But again, also, one thing I'm concerned about this conversation that I meant to add on the end of the last conversation, and I want to take you guys a preview for the next level of conversation. There's something damaging about the conversation we're having because it assumes, I'm taking you to the next level, binary gender. And that's something these new, latest generations, that's something that's always existed, but it's something that's people are becoming very conscious of. We're all not just males and females. And the debate isn't going to be male versus female, because people are feeling free to identify as they feel. And that does not necessarily fall into this binary pattern that we've been talking about, and that the Me Too movement, at least the way we've been talking about it, seems to set up. And I want us to be careful about that, because would it be hijacking for a male person to use the Me Too hashtag and report sexual harassment against them from a superior? I would hope it would not be seen as harassment. That there is a lot of sexual harassment that goes male against female, yes, but there is sexual harassment the other way, and there's domestic violence runs both ways as well. And we need to be cognizant it's not a one-way street, and it's not just a male-female issue. And actually, I know Ryan's generation, not to condescend, because when I listen they think differently, because when I listen to him speak, there's always a few extra words in each sentence I have to unpack, a disclaimer and a perception and a thoughtfulness that I don't have inherently, because I wasn't acculturated that way. So I have a steeper learning curve trying to be a good person than good in our current cultural context and evolution, as society seems to be going. Ryan, what do you think about that?
Follow that. Yeah, wow. Interesting piece of this in terms of who this is. The point about serving to create a discussion, I think that's one of those roles that people who have that status, that power, that authority, using that to elevate the discussion of people less fortunate than them, people in marginalized communities, people in underrepresented communities, is wonderful, and we shouldn't discredit that. Whether or not it's fixing this broad cultural system that we have, it's a system and a certain set of assumptions about the way things are working. That's tougher to say. I think in the last conversation there was a lot of discussion there was some discussion brought up about farm workers, particularly female farm workers, Latino farm workers, being the target of a staggering amount of sexual violence. Are those people empowered to bring this discussion to the table? Is Me Too elevating their voice? And it makes me think of other discussions of equity where if it's not serving all of us, it's not really succeeding. And I think there's a lot of areas in which where perhaps people in a place of privilege, people, white, people in particular are in a place of privilege is being able to elevate their voices in a way that people in other marginalized communities are not as empowered to do. And I think that is really an important part of this. I think that maybe that next step, that next evolution is elevating their voices. And I think this is actually, and speaking to men here, this is an important part of our role, is to step back when we are in a place with women who have the opportunity, or people of marginalized identities in particular, to step back when there's an opportunity for them to step forward. And when we're between other men, that's when it's our job to step up and talk to our friends about what is okay and what isn't okay, right? And to call them out when those discussions are happening that sound rather sexist, right? I think that's the challenge. It's almost kind of like only calling out something that's racist when you're around someone who's a person of color, right? It's like, no, we need to do that when those people aren't in the room. We need to be calling that out when they're not in the room. And that discussion is really difficult to have. It'll compromise your relationships in some cases with people that you know, because they'll say stuff that you really have to stand by as like, that's wrong. And until we start having those conversations with the people that we care about most, there may not be a whole lot of hope for this movement to continue forward, because the change has to happen among men. It really does. And it's our role, if we're going to be more nurturing, to elevate the voices of others. We've taken up a lot of space, men have. We take up a lot of space. I even felt a little uncomfortable coming here initially, because it's almost as if we're kind of like checking the conversation of the women, right? We're saying like, yes, but, right, here we are. And I think that happens a lot, where men are in a position to say like, yes, what these women have said is correct. Yes, we back them up on this, or no. So,
I think it's a great question about who's represented. So at Michigan State University at one time gave out more dissertations on Africa than any other university in the United States, and in a lot of cases more than universities in Africa. And then there started being a pushback. And the pushback was that these privileged individuals would go and study HIV, AIDS, poverty, water rights, whatever it was that they were studying, would get all this information, take all the time, all the resources from these villages and from these individuals and so on, go back, write their dissertation, get a professorship, and the people in the village never got anything for the work that they did, right? And yet, these people were being celebrated as being, folks that were African scholars. In reading, in getting ready for a discussion with my students coming up on, as I mentioned, sex trafficking and the rise of STIs. Even though I've known this, I've been in the field for 30 years. It still blows my mind when I read there are a lot of cultures, including in the United States, where women have no voice in what birth control is being used. Yeah, you think they're reading Me Too movement comments, right? Do you think their partners are saying, hey, I just read this Me Too thing, maybe we need to back off, maybe we need to step back and listen? No, I mean, this is, yeah, we are at a certain level of privilege that a lot of people aren't, and we need to understand that.
Rajeev, you talked earlier about the notion of how laws can't solve all our problems here, although they have certainly been helpful in getting us to a certain point. Is there more that we can do on the legal front or on the political front to promote more gender equity and more gender responsibility? Or is this all, as we ethics teachers like to talk about, just all come down to obedience to the unenforceable. Is it all a matter of morals and ethics? What more can be done legally or politically?
What a terrifying question. My answer is yes, no, and I don't know the answer to your question. Because, yes, Rajeev spoke very well. Yes, laws have brought us a long way, and they've done great things. But should we put more laws in place? What's the balance? Because you should fear a society that regulates you so heavily that you're no longer a human and have free will, right to pursue freedom, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and all the other wonderful things we all strive for in America. And one thing we should all strive for, at least, I strive for, is economic, gender, racial opportunity equality. But I don't want to make it a thought crime to say you have to like me because I'm brown, or I have to like you because you're X. There's so much our society do to help create equal opportunity that we have not achieved yet. And I believe that's a project we should engage in and be conscious of. But what the right balance is, or what the next step is, or if more steps are needed to be taken, I honestly do not know the answer to that question.
Can I say something to that real quick? There's a great, I don't know, great, but interesting situation with laws. In the late 1800s, pickpockets were rampant in London. So the folks who make the laws said, we'll make pickpocketing a capital crime, right? You can, and in fact, in some of the situations, one 13-year-old was hung for taking a spoon, right? What they found after this law was passed, that if you were caught as a pickpocket, that you could face the gallows, pickpocketing rates didn't decrease. Murder rates went up. And everybody's like, well, wait a minute, why, we always have this, again, probably not in this room, but bring back the death penalty, right? We have to eye for an eye, yada, yada, yada. Well, what they found about the law was, you passed the law, but you didn't change the life chances of these people who had to pickpocket to make it in society, right? This was a time, late 1800s, a lot of people in London were poor, and passing a law didn't change that. And now, if my mark catches me, they can turn me in and I'm murdered, I might as well just take care of them. That's one less witness, right? So having laws without cultural change can be problematic.
Yeah, and some of the conversations I've had with friends who are more intellectual, who really are thoughtful about this stuff and maybe still think differently than we do here, are very concerned about that sort of future. Now, I don't know whether this is sort of like a boogeyman kind of a thing that conservative outlets are pushing to say, like, look, if we continue to write laws about this stuff, eventually it's going to be Fahrenheit 451 up in here. It's like that is sort of the conversation happening in conservative circles, or people that purport themselves to be neutral but are actually in support of very traditional gender roles, and a more traditional interpretation of how men and women should be, male and female. And so I think that we need to be aware of that. There's a really it's important that we start to educate ourselves in how to have those conversations with people that are coming from those angles, because it sounds very educated, and it's important that we don't come at that with the kind of this aggressive, like we were talking about earlier, just shutting people down for having a different view, but approaching it empathetically. And so, I think that the piece of empathy that I would share with you, that I think I've noticed, is just that fear is very much there for people who are confused about their role in society with these changes, and understanding that is important to addressing their concerns in a way that doesn't make them feel shut down.
So I want to open up for questions here, but one more thing, just to get it out of the legal realm here, Rajeev. So, what should we say to our sons, and what should we say to our daughters?
I'm not a parent.
Hypothetically.
I have a 27-year-old son, and what we told him is, you're no different than anyone else. Don't buy into the labels. Right? You're a person. I remember coaching him in baseball, a little league, and we had a game where a player from the other team started pitching who happened to be female, and all my boys started laughing. I stood in front of him and I said, that person out there is a baseball player. And when you step up to the plate with a bat in your hand, you're a baseball player. Now go get it. All right. Stop with the labels. Yeah. That's what I told him.
I have a 2-year-old daughter, so I can buy time to answer this question. a little bit of time, but I do need to come up with an answer for this question. The answer we've thought about as a family, my wife and I, is a lot of these situations, especially again in context of our discussion here in the Me Too movement, is that a lot of these people are voluntarily put in positions of hierarchy. They need something. They need this job to feed who they need. They need to get this internship done so they can get into the career path they want to be in. They want to do this movie if they want to get paid and become a big star. Well, the thing I think my daughter needs to know from us is that as a family, we are always there for her, and you never need to be in a situation because some things are not worth the price, and the most important thing and value you should have in your life is your self-confidence and your autonomy, and sacrificing those things can really only lead to a path of pain and suffering. Now, she may not always have her family. Something tragic could happen to both of her parents and her cousins and grandparents, and we all go on a trip to Hawaii, and she's the last survivor, and I hope the one thing she'll take from that, aside from any inheritance, is, and life insurance policy, is that she should be confident in herself, and she should be able to call things out, stand up for herself, and be the best advocate for herself. Now, a lot of times, people can't be the best advocates for themselves, but if you're able to, that's the ultimate best defense in our society, is ultimately yourself.
Ryan, I'll let you off the hook on this one. We will open up to questions. We have one over here.
Hi, thank you for your time. My name's Meredith. About 1.5 years ago, I saw a movie here in Bellingham called The Mask We Live In. I don't know if some of you have seen that. It's about the very toxic male culture we have. And I've raised 2 sons, don't have any daughters, had 2 brothers, I'm the only girl. It just made me cry. So I think that, men sometimes feel victims because they've grown up in this toxic culture. I mean, at home, I've got my sons watching Mr. Rogers and, going to church and everything, but they're exposed to it in the media, they're exposed to it in schools. And something that Toby said about the culture with the athletes, sexual prowess is different than violence. I mean, rape is violence and power. It's not, and I think a lot of these boys are feeling powerless in this culture. So can you separate the sexual prowess thing from the violent nature of the male culture in our society?
I would start by saying everyone watch that film. It's on Netflix. I was crying throughout the whole thing. I experienced much of what you'll see in the film with male-on-male targeted harassment, some of it sexual too. So I think that there's, and I'm not using this to draw attention away from the plight that women face and the widespread sexual assault that's occurring there, but what we do see among men is the conditions by which men become predators and violent and sexually or otherwise. And it is men, in many cases, outing other men as being, or identifying other men as being, having feminine traits. And this is why I went at first, and I talked about this idea of male and female traits, because that is it's at the root of a lot of this too. maybe even more so than this toxic masculinity, which is a product of that. So, you know, when I was a kid, I was the kind of giddy, you know, smiley. I was really nerdy. I was pretty compassionate, and I was more, I think, more probably assigned more feminine traits in that way. And I was targeted a lot for that. And I think that that kind of stuff is what men do to keep other men in line, right? You see what happened to him, and that's the signal that all other men get around you, is that they get a signal that if you act like that, if you act compassionate, if you know, or if you even stick by that person. Many of the people who stood up for me were targeted as well for that kind of behavior, right? For aligning themselves with that person. So I think we need to be really aware of this mask that men set up over time to shield themselves from pain, to shield themselves from hurt, to prevent themselves from being targeted as having feminine traits. And understand that that those traits are things that all people can express, right? Women can be in places of authority. Men can be in places of authority. Men can be compassionate. Men can be caretakers, right? And changing that dynamic will do a lot over time to change the culture that sort of perpetuates violence against women.
Yes, my question is about the procedures, processes that universities take against alleged perpetrators of sexual misconduct. Our Secretary of Education has famously or infamously opined that these are very often unfair to the perpetrator. My question is, might they also be unfair to the victim as well? If the university does not take action, the whole thing is kind of quieted down and hushed up. It's a student record. Whereas, had one gone to the police, there's a police report that is a record of what happened that could be used at a later time. So ultimately the question is, perhaps for Professor Banerjee, what place does the university have judging on things which are criminal, perhaps even felonious, and how is that done as a say in Whatcom County? I mean, how often does the university, when hearing about something, actually notify the police? Not the campus police, but and how often might your office get involved in that? So the question is really for everybody about the university process. Thank you.
For 6 years, I was on the Student Faculty Judicial Board at Michigan State University, and heard a lot of sexual harassment cases come before us. I was also asked to be on some committees after some highly publicized rapes on campus. No campus wants to be the rape campus, right? So at Michigan State University, you have 50,000 students, and a number of those live in dorms. And when you look at the crime statistics, you'll see there's usually between 20 and 30 rapes per year. And every single student says that's a joke. Because what the university did at Michigan State, and I haven't been in that position here at Western, is if you want to bring charges against another student, there's a whole litany of things you have to do before you get to hear a hearing. And if there's a lot of alcohol involved and you're underage, do you come forward as a 19-year-old that you were drinking on campus? Because now you can be in trouble, right? You just got raped. And now the university is saying, why were you drinking? You were 19, right? Who wants to do that, right? So it's not a good system. It's not a good system.
People I know, friends of mine, people at the university, live amongst their rapists today. Okay, so and this is perhaps the furtherance of their trauma every day, is scanning for that person who raped them. And there's a part of me that that thinks, wow, does this person really deserve to be removed from campus permanently? And that right there it's a thought that comes up for me on that. And it's like, yes, that person's safety is absolutely important. I know people who cannot wait to get out of university to be away from that person. And that is not in furtherance of their education, is not in furtherance of their well-being or in their sense of safety in the world when those people are not held accountable. And that's a tough thing, because that person's life, who committed that crime may very well be ruined for a period of time. And for the crime they did, for the damage they did to that person, I don't know that there's a better solution but to make sure that they are not exposed to that person on a day-to-day basis, so that they don't have to avoid the bookstore or the cafeteria because that person could and is often there. I don't have a good answer to that, but I know that that is very real for people who I know on campus, and it's just awful. So.
I guess I would just say, if there's a crime occurring on a campus university, the answer is not to go to your resident advisor on your dorm floor, it's to call the police. And that's the way the criminal justice system works. And the university is not part of the criminal justice system. So if you want to remedy the problem, you need to follow the criminal justice system route, which doesn't always work, but that is the correct route, not the dorm hall monitor.
Question over here?
I think it's excellent and overdue and important that women are being heard now in ways they have not been previously. And I think we'll maybe know that systemic change is taking place when the groper-in-chief faces consequences. But my question follows from this discussion about accountability and consequences. There seems to be an inevitable conflict between the court of public opinion and the court system, which is our key to living by rule of law and assumes innocence until proof of guilt. And so if I'm right that there's an inherent conflict between the court of public opinion and the legal system, what do we need to be looking at to ensure that both victims and perpetrators get a fair shake? What needs to change?
Sounds like one for a lawyer to
Well,
answer.
Well, if you have a good idea, please bring it forward. Because that's another amazing thing about our country that's unlike, I'd say, 80% of the other countries in the world, is that we are a democracy. The laws don't just magically manifest themselves. The laws are created by people you make the conscious decision to elect and which you collectively organize to elect. It matters who you vote for. And if you're just voting on party lines, you're probably not going to get the result you want. You want to be focused. You want to know what it is you want to change. And after you elect the person, your job is not over. Democracy does not work unless you hold your elected officials accountable, and not just at election time, but that you hold their feet in the fire every day, and that you explain to them what it is that law you want to change. And if they're not responsive for you, well, then time to start organizing and change who it is that's representing you, whether it's in your party or not. Because these laws don't magically create themselves. These laws are created by you. You create these laws in democracy, and you are responsible for the laws in your democracy. And it's up to you to lobby your legislature. There's professional lobbyists who do it, and they're paid a lot to do it, but each and every one of you should be a lobbyist for your cause. And each and every one of you should not just be harassing your elected official, but all the other public officials in the state if you want to see change happen, and you should be banding together to make the change you want to see happen. Unfortunately, it gets back to the root. Well, if you have a good idea, bring it forward, because I'm not sure I have an answer to that.
I worked the first 7 years of my kid's life, and my husband was home. And now we've switched, and I'm the parent at home. And my kids who are in middle school have seen, like, my mom is an engineer, and she can do it. And so my daughter thought she was really strong. Well, has been bullied for the last 2 years, and we only found out about it in February by these boys. One of the boys who wanted her to take, because they all have phones, a pornographic picture and send it to him of one of her teammates. She didn't do it. She says, "Mom, I know that would be child porn that I would be sending." And so it's been going on and on and on, and the school has kind of just tried to like shove it under, like, oh, it doesn't really. At first they thought it might be bullying. Now they're saying, oh, well, it doesn't really rise to that level. And they wrote a letter to the parents of the two boys now. There's a kind of a whole gang of them. that it was like not rising to the level of bullying. So we were in this morning at the school meeting with the principal, a vice principal, and a counselor. So it's happening in our schools. My question is, how do we change this? This culture's still out there. If you tell you're called a snake, it used to be a snitch in my age, and so the kids all hide it, but they have their phones, so it's worse than it ever was. This is going on in the middle school, so I'm sure it's going on in the high schools as well. All the kids know about it. How do we change that?
The school cannot remain silent. I mean, that sends the message to the perpetrators that it is okay, that it will not be punished.
And schools are run by elected officials also.